In addition to my role at PFIZER, I'll just mention one additional role that I think it's relevant to today, is I co-chair the Economic Committee for the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, focused on really evaluating and building a new value framework for cell and gene therapy. That's with the ARM Foundation. And so some of the work that we did in that space in terms of landscaping, what's out there with health technology assessments and what are payers saying, I'll share today, as well as some data that I thought was very relevant, published by the National Pharmaceutical Council in a survey they did of leading national carriers and some regional payers. So let's, maybe before I jump in, just the normal disclaimer that these are my views and opinions, not necessarily a PFIZER's. So what's different about cell and gene therapy? And this chart here essentially just gives us an idea of the patient prevalence. And I wouldn't even worry too much about the axes. Just know that over time, with these potential curative therapies, it's going to work a little bit or a lot differently from chronic treatment. So you have this initial amplification because you have some incident cases and there's some catch-up treatments potentially, patients who are not treated today but waiting for a therapy to recently launch. And then you're going to see that trail off, right, if it's working right, and you won't be treating these patients going forward. Not for all cases. There are some gene therapies that are more chronic, but predominantly the gene therapy cases are going to be more of one and done type treatments. And what we hear a lot about in the news today are the cost implications, the prices. And what you could see in this chart here is that you really need to be thoughtful about time. So what's the cost over time? Like when we do any type of financial analysis or budgeting exercise, is that it's not just about year one and year two. You want to kind of look out over time, especially if your gene therapy is treating a condition that heretofore would have been treated over an extended period of time. This is the case, of course, in a number of the therapeutic areas, specifically with pediatric cases for a couple of the gene therapies on the market today. So it really is relevant to be thoughtful about, okay, what happens year one? You can see the blue bar on the far left is gene therapy, and you can see these are mean numbers, but we're not looking at a very large sample size, right? So I would look at these as directional, right? And so the gene therapy case in this case is potentially $1 million, right? And you see how that compares to some biologics on the market. And the red bar is the mean for orphan drug biologics. And after a few years, year three, the gene therapy is costing a bit less than some of the leading biologics on the market. And then by year four, it's pretty much equivalent to the mean. And by year five, it's less expensive. And you could see how that would continue out. But there's really quite a wide range. And obviously with the headlines about the $2.1 million Zolgensma product, there's something that needs to be said and done about affordability for both payers, national, regional, and patients. And so you could see some of the launches here over the last couple of years in this space and what's coming down the pike. And over 70 therapies are expected to launch by 2030. I mean, that's enormous, right? We've heard the former FDA commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, talk about this, and with high hopes and optimism in terms of number of launches. But there's going to be economic consequences, and the way I heard someone describe it at a gene therapy conference is, we have therapies that are really made for the Jetsons age, and we have a reimbursement system that's made for the Flintstones age. And so how do you get the Jetsons and the Flintstones to kind of operate together? Well, one way to think about it is there's different archetypes. So you just you kind of hear gene therapy, cell therapy being grouped as one type of therapy, but it's not. And this is just one way to think about it. These are 4 macro archetypes introduced by MIT Newdigs. But I thought they were quite useful. One is around novel breakthroughs in terms of really ultra-orphan disease, less than 100 patients in some cases. And some of the first launches in Europe, like Strimvalis by GSK, were in this box. So real breakthrough therapies, very small populations, no alternative treatments. The next box is oncology, and half of the expected new gene therapies in that pipeline slide I showed you are expected to be in oncology. So really, that's a very large proportion, obviously, and it's something to be thoughtful about, that all the things that we're working on in oncology in terms of value-based care are relevant to gene therapy, so quite an overlap there. And the third is orphan disruptors, and you could see some of the examples like beta thalassemia, with like the Bluebird Bio product that's under consideration for approval right now in the US and approved in Europe, and these quantum leaps like hepatitis C. And hepatitis C is a different type of treatment. So you remember that first chart I showed you that had the sort of the one and done type of treatment format. That's not true for hep C today. And so it's important to think through the gene therapy type models that are going to be more chronic treatment. And that's like hemophilia, for instance, might work a bit differently. And so the economics and the phasing of payment and the measurement of performance just need to be tackled differently when you compare these 4 different types that we just described. So what varies when you look across those 4 archetypes? So there's treatment heterogeneity. So it's just going to work differently. So it's not going to work the same across all patient subtypes. The durability of effect is going to be different. So the duration of response is going to be different. Sometimes the difference could be a standard of care today that treats by the month to a standard of care tomorrow that could be a lifetime treatment. And that's obviously has enormous financial implications in terms of how you would evaluate a difference in performance that way. Age of administration could be different, mode could be different, and onset of action could be different. And these are just scratching the surface. There's a lot of other factors that are heterogeneous across these different gene therapies. So now let's turn to what this means for payers and other stakeholders in the system, providers and pharma companies and patients too. But first, there's actuarial risk. So how do you predict number of patients that you will see in your population? Some people call these black swan events because they're low probability but high impact. And so they're very difficult to plan for. I've had a couple of regional plans tell me that just 1 or 2 patients can bust their budget for the year. And so this is something that is difficult to grapple with. Performance risk. Another way to think about the risk here is, so after this is said and done, you have the clinical trials that prove it. The real world is different from the clinical trial space. And so there's some uncertainty about what will the real world effectiveness look like? Will it match what we saw in trials? So that's something that also needs to be considered and potentially measured. And then payment timing. So this isn't something we've thought about a lot in healthcare, not from a pharmaceutical standpoint, a biologic standpoint, but should we be phasing payment over time to marry it with the benefits being conferred over time? That sounds good on paper, but as you all know better than me, that you run into a lot of issues and challenges trying to operationalize that, because not many plans would budget in a multiple year format. We know through natural cycling of patients can come and go inside of 3 years quite often. And so this concept of changing the payment structure to phase it sounds good, but it has practical limitations, and we're going to talk a little bit about what those limitations are. So if you kind of classify these risks of actuarial risk and payment risk and performance risk, so A and P and T for that timing, for the phasing. It's also important to think about the different lines of business or different types of payers. You've got fully insured, you've got Medicare, you've got Medicaid, you've got self-insured. And again, this is meant to be roughly right, directionally right. And the source here, again, is MIT Newdigs. But I think they're making the point that when you think about value-based agreements and designing them, you can't design them sort of as sort of a one homogeneous example, one model that's going to work across the board for all these different types of payers, because they all have individual needs and concerns about bearing the risk. So here's some data that I found interesting from the NPC survey they did of national and regional payers. So the first chart tells us that 80%, so 4 out of 5 plans thought they were very highly concerned of the financial risk associated with gene therapies. And then you could see the regional plans were equally concerned, but they just kind of broke it down to level 4 and level 5. So this is on their radar, right, when you go out and ask them about what's coming down the pike. A little bit of a difference here, though. The national plans said, we're ready to essentially look at value-based arrangements in terms of how to mitigate some of this risk. Whereas the regional plans, only about half of them felt like they were ready, and the other half felt like this was maybe coming down the pike, but not there yet. So this question got at what factors would impact the organization's willingness to enter into a value-based agreement. So like what matters to them? And you can see from the chart, the yes being in green, that the ones that pop are really in the middle 3. So I'll go from left to right. So therapy that involves one-time administration. So that concept of being true to that one and done curative type treatment, that for them would be a good trigger to enter into a value-based agreement. 2 is therapy directly reduces budget. And so there's some kind of total cost of care savings associated with it. And that's another way to look at it. 3 is therapy is a cure versus patients still requiring treatment. So kind of related to the second column. But essentially, those 3 factors is what the payers thought would make this fundamentally different from other products that they're covering and reimbursing. So what are some of the biggest benefits for your organization of accepting such a proposal? And you can see the responses here. The major benefit is only paying for therapy that works. So that's important to them. And the flip side of that was, from the survey responses I read, it became like a deal breaker. So if they're going to enter into these value-based agreements for these potentially transformative therapies, cell and gene therapy, they want to make sure it works. They want to make sure that therapy actually does what it says it does. And so I think the value-based agreements that will potentially be designed have to reflect that uncertainty and the importance of measuring real-world performance. And so that was my takeaway on this one. You could see some of the other the data points that were also important to them, like reducing uncertainty of looking when costs will occur, and in terms of timing of the costs and benefits with the second and third columns. So there was some question here about the tools that the organization would use to manage financial risk. So you can see from this chart that although there's some concern about exclusions, the first column there says a carrier would use exclusion from coverage. And you could see for most of the cases, for the community commercially full insured, the large payers, and some of the TPAs, even for the smaller payers and the Medicare Advantage plans, that it's not likely that they would exclude. Stop-loss insurance or reinsurance looks like a likely tool. But when I pressed on this, and I did talk to a couple of national PBMs, and one was the chief transformation officer, and they expressed concern about using stop-loss insurance in the sense that coverage would be difficult the year after you got stop-loss benefit for something like this. And there's also concern about, maybe you can't predict it today, but after a few of these are launched on the market, it becomes more predictable. And whether or not stop-loss is a panacea is debatable. And so stop-loss is one to really monitor. And I'll get into this in a couple of slides, but there's a number of initiatives. MIT has an initiative. It was covered by Duke Margolis Center in their white paper. I see some commercial plans that are launching some carve-out benefit structures around essentially reinsurance type of products for gene therapies that could be offered to other plans, specifically regional plans. So this one is worth really monitoring. Carve-out benefits and separate benefit structure also looks likely from the survey responses. And then the idea of smoothing the payment over time, well, maybe over 1 to 2 years, but becomes much less likely after that. And that probably has to do with a forecast of how long you're going to be covering these patients for. So I thought this was an interesting set of data points. So now the question came to what are the biggest barriers to your organization accepting alternative payment models and milestone and other alternative-based payment schemes. And you can see on the first column on the far left, paying for patients who are no longer actively insured by me. So the concern here is, again, around portability. And so if I'm going to have a milestone-based payment, either linked to performance or maybe not even linked to performance, but just phased, like you probably saw the Bluebird proposal out there that phases the payment essentially over a period of, I think, 5 years, and it essentially makes the payment to be contingent on whether or not the product is working. But in order for a payment model like that to work, you need to be able to forecast over those 3 to 5 years and understand who's going to be at risk during that period of time. And you can see here that's a concern. And almost a flip side of that, paying for patients who are no longer responding to therapy is important to them. So we heard that in their first response, that they don't want to pay for therapies that don't work. And then having to accept agreements, sort of adopting agreements from patients that are coming into their plan. So let's say CMS allows for some portability in gene therapy of insurance members to move from plan to plan with a payment plan, hypothetically. It looks like from these responses that there's some concern about how that would work and how the risk would be borne both by the original carrier as well as the next carrier. So some interesting concepts I think are being discussed out there, but it's not clear exactly how to operationalize them. It is clear that there's a healthy debate about how to make it work, and there's a number of proposals being presented to CMS and CMMI. And it seems like there's some multidisciplinary interest, meaning you've got some academic think tanks, you've got some payers, you've got some pharma companies, potentially even providers in the mix as well, around standing up some of the new payment models and financing models for gene therapy. So with that in mind, U.S. public policy creating barriers. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. There's a lot of content you probably are very well aware of, but just if you look at it from what's stopping a number of pharma companies to engage with payers and PBMs on drawing up these innovative contracts around gene therapy, well, two things come to mind. One is Medicaid best price, because just looking at the simple math of if you're phasing payment over time or you're guaranteeing it based on performance, it's always going to be calculated in terms of what the sort of your lowest common denominator is in terms of price. And that's going to have implications on best price if you do that, unless you have some type of waiver. And we know that 4 states, Oklahoma, Michigan, Colorado, and Louisiana, have received approval from Medicaid programs, sort of allowing safe harbor to design some of these value-based programs without best price implications. Dr. Rebecca Gee from Louisiana was instrumental in doing this for Hep C, if you might recall, earlier this year, which really was kind of uncharted territory, getting these waivers to enable these types of deals. So I expect to see a lot more of those. You can imagine if you see those 4 states, other states are, I'm sure, on the game in terms of trying to create these value-based waivers to negotiate these new types of contracts. And the other one is anti-kickback statute. So not only does that impact payer-provider, and we saw the CMS proposed rule on physician self-referral, allowing for some more value-based designs and integrated care. Hey, that's great news. But there's still concerns for pharma companies getting involved in value-based programs that could have implications around anti-kickback statute, creating value for providers or incentive for providers to engage in these types of programs. So the impact is negative, essentially, of these 2 restrictions on the prevalence and the incidence, if you will, of value-based agreements. But the good news is that I find that there's a lot of interest in reconciling these concerns. And I see it across the board. I hear it when I'm in meetings in academia, like in MIT or the Duke Margolis Center, or discussions with big payers and providers. It seems like there's mutual interest that we got to get the policy right to enable these types of programs. And I think it's important to think about health technology assessment. I do, because I think they play a pivotal role today in how we cover and reimburse products. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do this. I don't think there's any one correct way to do it. I think there's a lot of shortcomings associated with trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, meaning taking HTA frameworks that have been designed for yesterday's drugs and trying to apply them to tomorrow's solutions. So it's not going to work so neatly for all the reasons I showed before about those 4 archetypes, and the prolonged nature of the benefit, the curative nature of the benefit, value of hope provided to some of these patients. These products are fundamentally different from conventional products that we've covered, even biologic products. And so I do think it's imperative that health technology assessment agencies take these nuanced characteristics into context when developing these frameworks. So I think there's interest in that space. I know that there's been a number of press releases by ICER and NICE. NICE we kind of went back a few years ago and tried to run some models comparing what they called multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA, sort of a new technique, in this case, applied to gene therapy versus the conventional way they've been doing it. They concluded, at least at that time, that the old way of doing it was fine. I think that's still open to debate. And one of the reasons why the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, their foundation, has set up this economic committee to stand up a new value framework for cell and gene therapy, essentially looking at a whole host of new types of variables that are patient-centric. And then the hope would be that the ARM Foundation value framework is taken into consideration by some of the HTA agencies. And you could see some history here. I'm not going to go through all the background, but you could see I spoke to how NICE ran their models on CAR T a number of years ago. You could see the ICER models on CAR T shown to be cost-effective. So that was surprising to some, but when you look at the benefit conferred by the products, when ICER ran these analyses, they found these to be cost-effective. And so I think a lot of work still needs to be done in this space. I did take a look at sort of a breakdown of the framework inputs. So what does get incorporated into these HTA assessments for gene therapy? And you could see the list here. Of course, cost of acquisition is front and center, and that green box means that it is considered by these frameworks. We've got NICE CAR T as an example, we've got ICER Luxturna as an example, and ICER CAR T as an example. And you could kind of see as you move on down the chart, healthcare utilization, population size, administration, quality of life even, lifetime horizon, were all considered as factors for their frameworks. Hospital markup around some of these was not considered. Innovative payment models, not considered by Luxturna for the Luxturna evaluation. And then some other considerations around nursing home care, caregiver burden, non-medical costs, not considered by NICE, but considered by ICER in some. And sort of that gives you kind of an example of some of the inputs that could be considered. And another way to look at it is to kind of break it down to these buckets. So when you look at the HTA models, what we thought was important was that population size is considered, meaning small patient population leads to higher prices to offset development costs. So it is important to consider the orphan and sometimes ultra-orphan status of these populations when evaluating. Lifetime horizon is also important. That's hard for some payers and easier for others. For NICE and for other single-payer systems, that's a little bit easier to look at a lifetime horizon. That's more complicated, of course, in the US. But that was considered important in terms of HTA modeling of value in gene therapy. It was a lifetime time horizon. Patient indirect cost during treatment was also considered. So loss of productivity. Some of these patients are in the prime of their lives, or they have the prime of their lives to look forward to, and productivity is important, not just for them, but also for society. And so that's something to be considered, especially when you're looking at a potentially one-time treatment that could be curative versus chronic treatment that takes people away from their jobs for long periods of time. Patient and caregiver non-medical costs, not really covered adequately yet, but there's definite interest in this space. And the HTA models we saw out there, kind of pointed to the importance of accounting for caregiver and patient non-medical costs. If you think about what's happening in the US, the concept of going to centers of excellence for treatment. You may have seen an article last week about Amazon employees going to City of Hope for treatment. I mean, this is the new trend we're finding, right, is to have, especially in gene therapy, it's unlikely you're going to have centers of excellence in every state of the US focused in all the therapeutic areas for gene therapy. It's more likely that you're going to see, a dozen or so of these centers of excellence, and there's going to be some type of transportation required and time off of work required for the patient, for the caregiver. So it's important to consider those types of costs and benefits associated with caregiver and patient burden that's non-medical nature. So that's one bucket. The next bucket is, here's what we glean from the literature when looking out there. Age of onset is important. So younger patients will gain significantly larger value from curative treatment across all inputs. So it's important to take that into consideration. I think that's what we're finding is being done. And that was called out in the ICER reviews for Zolgensma, if you remember, for the pediatric indications in particular, that value is amplified for that patient population. Additional value for curative in nature, so modifying cost-effectiveness thresholds. So most of the HTA agencies have thresholds, cost per $50,000 per quality adjusted life year or $100,000 per quality adjusted life year. Well, there was general sentiment is that those thresholds should change for curative treatment. And you could argue that quality is one way to measure that in terms of capturing the curative nature with a quality adjusted life year, but it's imperfect, and there should be other ways that are considered that maybe are more disease specific. Not just looking at the indirect cost for treatment, so we found that in the HTA model, but in the literature, there was a call out for following those indirect costs over time. And again, you have to be thoughtful of, what's the alternative treatment, the standard of care today. So in lieu of the gene therapy, what type of chronic treatment is required? And does that chronic treatment require significant non-medical costs to be incurred? We may not have paid too much attention to that historically because we were looking at alternatives that also required treatment that were chronic in nature. But if you look at a curative treatment that really obviates the need to follow that patient in such an intensive manner going forward, you have to be thoughtful of all the direct and indirect medical costs and even intangible costs that go along for the ride, if you will, in the patient journey. Real-world evidence was called out in the literature. I think this is a key one. Because if I go back to the other slides I showed you about, deal breakers from a payer perspective was around, well, yeah, I'll go into a VBA on this, but I only want to pay if it works. Well, I get that, especially if you're talking about treatments on average of $1 million. And so RWE is key to prove real-world benefit, real-world cost, real-world risk. And so I think continuing to refine the validity and the reliability of these data to be used for not just value-based agreements, but just to follow up on these patients to understand real-world effectiveness and safety is also of paramount importance. And I think the RWE Guidance document that was released by the FDA last year is really an instrumental document, not just for for what it was in terms of making recommendations about good practices, if you will, in terms of RWE generation. But also, it actually, I think, plays an integral role for VBA design. They didn't call out VBAs in that document, of course. It's a regulatory document around regulatory submissions. But it essentially tells you there's a right way and a wrong way to generate real-world data to measure what you intend to measure. And if VBAs are all about real-world performance measurement, we want to make sure we do this in a valid and reliable way, in a transparent fashion. So it's not a black box to anybody. It shouldn't be a black box to the payer, to the pharma company, to the provider, even to the patient. And so there has to be some tools and techniques out there that analyze these data in a way that's valid and reliable. And I think we are heading in the right direction in that case. Even techniques like blockchain technologies are being tested in this space to enable data to follow the patient in a transparent fashion, so there's a single source of truth that everybody can see, one dashboard, and understand how a product is performing. I think those types of technologies are going to be instrumental in VBAs for gene therapy. And then innovative payment and contracting, well, that's what we're here to talk about today. That was called out in the literature. And then, there's some other ideas that were raised in different policy forums. Societal impact, patient-centered endpoints, and patient and caregiver non-medical costs were also called out. And so there's a lot to be done. I mean, that's the moral of the story with this chart, is that essentially those boxes you see up there, we haven't tackled them adequately yet in terms of health technology assessment. And so if we intend to evaluate gene therapy properly, we're going to need to figure out a way to gain consensus on how to measure these boxes and what level of evidence is relevant and necessary to underpin these value claims. And if we get there, you could see value-based agreements of the future actually focusing on some of these boxes. I mean, I think it would be a great thing if we can create a value-based agreement for gene therapy that actually follows a patient home, uses wearables and sensors and other Internet of Things to essentially demonstrate the value of the product in a patient-centric way that can be measured in a valid and reliable fashion so that everybody can agree that this is how the product is working and how it was intended to work and how we're going to govern the coverage and reimbursement of the product. So my last slide I'll share with you guys is just kind of a look at what's out there in terms of innovative payment models around gene therapy. And these are just top line bullets, and you guys could dig into this. It's all in the public domain. You could see Luxturna has a few of these value-based arrangements with Harvard Pilgrim, with Cigna. There's a CMS demonstration project. With Cigna, there's actually, I think I mentioned earlier, there's a benefit carve-out, essentially a new product that they're offering. If you want to Google it, it's under Embark, and that's the name they use for the program. But essentially, it's like someone described it to me as like flood insurance. It's essentially providing a reinsurance type product for regional players around gene therapy, so that it's based on a PMPM fee, where there would be catastrophic coverage for patients that were diagnosed with these conditions and received these products. And there would be also a pay down on the copay or coinsurance for the patient, at least the way I understand it. And so that's an interesting product that was just released earlier this year and socialized. I imagine we'll see more of those going forward. And then you could see a couple of other products I mentioned in Europe, Imligic and Strimvelis. There's a pay-for-performance contract with NICE in the UK. That's not unusual for a lot of expensive therapies, especially like in oncology. You see some of these market access schemes where there's some type of pay-for-performance element. They were the first ones to launch this, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago now in oncology. And they've done it with multiple sclerosis as well, so I expect we'll see more of those. And then IFA's in Italy. That's the HTA agency in Italy, where Strimvelis is being contracted. And with Kymriah, there was a CMS demonstration project. Looks like they took a run at that, CMS did, in terms of standing up a new model for pay for performance. and then pulled back on that program the way I understand it last year, and leaving it to the regions now to work it out and operationalize it. But you know, the novel financing reimbursement structure, there's still healthy skepticism out there, right? The lack of infrastructure to track these patients over time, the lack of interoperability to share data across systems, the lack of portability in terms of taking a payment plan and moving it from a plan to another plan, let alone to another state. You know, these are not without their policy restrictions and complications. The innovative payment models that reduce budget impact and spread risk over time seem like they're of great interest. But we need to figure out a way to overcome some of the policy challenges, and then we need to make it work from a business-to-business standpoint for both the payer, the pharma company, the provider, and then most importantly, it has to be patient-centric. So I think getting back to some of the discussions we've heard earlier today, you know, using big data and analytics, we heard on a panel this morning about using Alexa and having a lot more voice response from patients. I think this space of gene therapy, where you really need to follow a patient over a prolonged period of time to measure the curative nature of the intervention, is going to be a great testing ground for some of these new technologies to track the patient's preference in terms of benefit and risk. And we could even get at, you know, some of these difficult to evaluate benefits, like the value of hope, which is something that I think is very important to gene therapy patients, gene therapy manufacturers, gene therapy providers and payers, but difficult to evaluate. So I'll conclude my presentation there. I think we have 5 minutes. If there are any questions, I might be able to answer. Do you guys know your gene therapy, or I've done a decent job explaining it to you, or you're just bored? No questions? Okay, well, thanks for your time.